You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 458 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering mass data collection by the U.S. government. I have some updates on Assange's extradition hearing. I'm going to talk about the multi-front war going on in Syria and the very dangerous situation unfolding between the Syrian government, Russia, and Turkey. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it at the Libertarian Institute. I am the news editor there, and I write the daily news roundup for the site. You find the show on the homepage, libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. You can either get just Foreign Policy Focus on its own podcast feed, or sign up for the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, and you get Foreign Policy Focus, The Scott Horton Show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, and other great podcasts. Last, think about donating to the show over at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about on today's show is the mass data collection program that was approved under the USA Freedom Act. Now, I think this mass spying is definitely related to the expanding U.S. empire and the terror wars, so it is something that I've covered on, Foreign Policy Focus. That said, I'm not as much, of paying attention to U.S. law and what's going on there. But from my understanding, the USA Freedom Act was in part a replacement and substitute for parts of the U.S. mass surveillance program. I believe it was called Stellar Wind and exposed by Edward Snowden. So under the USA Freedom Act, I guess the mass data collection program, the data was often held by the service providers themselves rather than by the government. And so this created a problem when the government requested things. Service providers, I guess, rather than doing what some people would suspect, and that is not give the government enough information, apparently they're too loose with it and just give the government everything. When you think about it, though, this isn't surprising. The U.S. government is probably the biggest part of the U.S. economy, I guess. Maybe if you combine some industries together, and the energy industry is actually bigger than the U.S. government or something like that. But as far as, a single bidder goes and, the people you want to appease the most, that's certainly the U.S. government in our society. So if these companies are looking for contracts, or hell, a lot of these telecommunication companies, Sprint and T-Mobile, as an example, have either merged or have tried to merge through the years, and the U.S. government is something that could prevent that. And so I think it's pretty safe to speculate that these companies would look to remain on the U.S. government's good side much more than they would any single consumer. I mean, if I have my business at Sprint and, I figure out they're giving the government too much of my money and decide to go elsewhere, well, I mean, over my lifetime, it's going to be maybe a couple $1,000s that they'll end up losing. But, I was recently reading an article about how much U.S. munitions cost. I mean, one Hellfire missile costs, $30,000 to $100,000. So while, T-Mobile isn't selling Hellfire missiles or anything like that, just the scale and the size of the U.S. government contracts are so massive that, clearly the incentive would be to suck up to the U.S. government, not the individual consumers. So an interesting new note found out about this mass data collection program is that has led to zero arrests. Apparently it generated 2 leads, or some evidence that it generated was involved in 2 different cases. But these mass surveillance programs don't do what is advertised. Now, the American people get suckered into believing these because of the war hysteria. We'll get everybody worked up, and, we think we're under threat of Russians or terrorists or Chinese or North Koreans, Iranians, etc., etc. And so we think, well, the government has to put some surveillance capabilities in place, and, if we could, spy on the terrorists a little bit, then that'll be a good deal for the rest of us. Obviously, that's not what happens, because it's failed to, prevent or, produce any arrest or convictions. And so this program is clearly a failure. The reason this program is currently in the news isn't because Congress finally started paying attention to the Constitution, or is necessarily, looked at some data and is concerned about the lack of success of the program, but rather it is set to expire on March 15th and must be continued. Now, I would really prefer it if these programs didn't exist at all, but thankfully they're still putting sunsets in for these, unlike they do for the AUMFs. And this is why, sunset provisions are something that are fairly important, and, advocate for having them more frequently, not less. And so it forces Congress to deal with these issues that they otherwise would go years and years without addressing, like, we've seen with like the 2001 or 2002 AUMFs that are still used to justify military force, up to the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. It does seem that there's some interest in Congress in not renewing this program, so hopefully this kind of information that is not working and is spying on civilians and giving the government more data than they should have is going to be something that wakes a couple of congressmen up, and if we get enough momentum going in the right direction, then maybe this program gets killed. However, we do have Attorney General Bob Barr going in front of Congress, and I'm sure saying this program is so important, we can't get rid of it. It'll help the terrorists if we do, while the empirical evidence doesn't show that. All right, moving on to some other news. The U.S. is going to restart training of Saudi soldiers, I guess, on military aircraft. This after the Pensacola-based shooting. The U.S. talked about ending the Saudi program. At the time, I had talked about maybe this would be a case where Trump's American first type rhetoric kind of takes control. And while I certainly don't agree with all of his, MAGA, get the Muslims out of the country rhetoric, I don't think that we should be training Saudi pilots because the Saudis are committing a genocide in Yemen. And so if this ends up being what shuts down the program, then, good riddance to it. And I thought maybe that American first type style would take charge here, seeing how some American soldiers died on U.S. territory. But nope, that program has now been restarted in full. It seems the only change is they have passed some official rules about the Saudi military personnel being able to carry firearms. I also think that was a real chance in this country to discuss the contempt that some of these Sunni Arabs have for the U.S. and how it's actually these people who are from U.S. allied countries, the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, that end up committing terrorist acts in the United States. And it's often plotted out and planned either in Western countries or, in this case, just in the U.S. itself. And how it's not the Iranians or Hezbollah or the Houthis that are carrying out attacks and are a threat to the U.S. All right, the U.S. has apparently blacklisted several Lebanese for being associated with their Martyrs Foundation, just to add to the enormously long list of people the United States and countries and industries that the U.S. has sanctioned at this point. All right, so the U.S. and South Korea have postponed or suspended some joint military drills because of the coronavirus outbreak in South Korea. So I haven't talked about the coronavirus a whole lot on the show, in part because at least I think the media coverage that I've seen is pretty hysterical. Now, it may be a real threat to some people. It's, not deadly at all. It seems that a couple thousand people have died, and it's something to take serious. But at the same time, it's like every single soccer game that gets postponed or relocated or rescheduled because of the coronavirus is news, and it's just way out of proportion. However, it's drifting more into the territory of having some impacts on geopolitics. I've talked about, what impacts this may have on protest movements in Hong Kong, Iran, Iraq, but also now the suspension of these joint military drills. It seems to be, like one of those, like, hey, maybe this is not a positive that you had the corona outbreak in South Korea, but at the very least, it's causing people to not be able to fearmonger and create so much tension and strife at every single moment. And so it could be a way to just make sure things on the Korean Peninsula don't start going in the wrong direction. And, who knows when or if these war games will return, but not having the war games will likely help not exacerbate tensions with North Korea. Trump has proposed spending $2.5 billion to combat the coronavirus. The Democrats saw this number and tripled it plus a little bit more. Chuck Schumer wants to spend $8.5 billion. So it seems like as much as these people want to like pretend that this is a major disaster, they're absolutely willing to play politics too. If people are, gonna get interested in maybe doing a foreign policy focus that focuses on the coronavirus, I try to think of a guest to have on. I've looked at some of the data. One of the kind of couple things that I've seen are with now over 2,000 global deaths, it's caught up to the Congo Ebola outbreak that's been going on for about a year in total number of deaths. And so, just seeing that number compared to the coronavirus number and the amount of attention they each get from the media makes me think that they're probably blowing it out of proportion a little bit. And then I was looking at kind of a breakdown of what percentage of people are dying from the coronavirus. And while it seems more deadly than the flu that I had a couple weeks ago, at the same time, it's not until you get to people that are 60s, 70s, and 80s that even over 2 or 3% of the people who contract it are dying. Actually a week ago, I was sitting in the ER waiting room with the flu, and they had like a little TV fact sheet on about the flu. And they point out that tens of thousands of people are going to die this year of the flu. When I talked to the ER doctor, he explained to me that, hey, you're not super young, you're not super old. And so there's not a whole lot of risk of dying from the flu. But, once you get older, you get the flu. It's the kind of thing that could kill you. And so, I think there's reason to be worried about the coronavirus. And I'm not saying that it's a good idea to travel to Wuhan, China or something like that. I just, at this point, kind of tend to think that the crisis there is being blown out of proportions at this point. But I'll continue to keep an eye on it. Again, if somebody wants me to do a show. Last story coming from the U.S., and that is Iran hawk Lindsey Graham and Bob Menendez, their Democratic and Republican senators, are looking to introduce a bill that would have like a new nuclear deal for the Middle East that I think would require countries to essentially give up the right to enrichment. This is something that Iran isn't going to get into, but a couple people have made this point. I believe Daniel Larison and Tyler Curtis are the two that I read. Daniel Larison, of course, at the American Conservative, and Tyler Curtis over at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. What this is going to do is it could hem in what a future Democratic, assuming that Trump loses in 2020. I don't know if that's going to happen, but if he does, this could be something that limits the new president's ability to negotiate or re-enter the Iran nuclear. So it's problematic in that way. All right, some updates on the Assange hearing. One thing that's been pointed out by the Julian Assange defense team is that this isn't like one of the court shows that you see on TV where the defendant gets to sit next to their lawyer. Julian Assange is actually in this bulletproof box that I believe is attached to the prison. And this is something that I first saw constructed when I was a little bit younger, watching when they were holding the trials for mobsters in Italy. I believe in like the 80s or 90s, they were trying to kind of clean up the mob scene. And what they did is they just built the courtroom around the jail. And so that way you didn't have to transfer the prisoners anywhere, risk somebody escaping in that way. You just bring everybody to the jail. And so in that case, I think it was more like a cage that the people were sitting in. But in Julian Assange's case, he's sitting in the back of a courtroom. I've seen one picture of the courtroom from above. You kind of see the lawyers and the judge and some people sitting in the gallery. But you actually cannot see Julian Assange, and that's because he's apparently in the back of this courtroom in a bulletproof glass box. Now, Assange says it's really hard to see in there, and I guess there's microphones in there, so it's not like really a place that he could talk to his lawyers and have any kind of confidential conversations. And so it's really problematic that you have this guy who is essentially being put through a show trial since he can't even really understand his own defense at this point, literally can't hear it. Now, the judge said that she doesn't think she even has the power to allow Julian Assange to sit next to his lawyer, even though, he's not an international terrorist who this was built for. I don't think anybody really is under the belief that Julian Assange is, one, in any kind of physical condition, or two, him or his followers are capable of like sabotaging a truck and attacking it on the road is, transferred to and from prison or something like that. And so it really doesn't make sense that he has to be in this, glass box. The defense, the prosecution, or whatever the UK equivalent of it is, a man by the name of John Lewis, I believe, said that he's fine with Julian Assange not seeing the bots. He just has to be handcuffed to somebody from the, the government, which also seems absurd. Like, let this guy sit next to his lawyers. From the physical condition that he's been reported to be, I don't think he's making any wild escapes out of the courtroom. Let this guy be able to, have a natural defense that he can understand, confer with his lawyers, make sure he gets clarity when he needs it, and there could be some kind of fair trial. All right, news out of Russia is that they've tested their new hypersonic missile, but they fired it from a ship this time. We do have something of a new arms race going on and a new Cold War between the U.S. and China, or the Russia and China. This could certainly be ramped down if the U.S. had any interest in, there was any political will in the United States at all to get along better with Russia and reduce the nuclear weapons stockpiles. But, after 3 years of Russiagate, and again, getting Russia ready for this new Russiagate that they're rolling out in 2020, it doesn't seem like the political will is going to be anywhere in the United States anytime soon to kind of reverse this dangerous path that we're walking down. One of the reasons it's so dangerous is because of Syria. So just to update, I think the probably best way to say it is there's probably 3 fronts still going on in Syria. The first being the Syrian government trying to fend off or essentially kind of flots as the Israeli military has taken advantage of the instability in Syria to hit either Hezbollah, Iranian, or Palestinian, or Syrian government targets in that country. In recent weeks, there's been airstrikes in Damascus against Palestinian targets, and then the Syrian media said that an Israeli drone killed a Syrian civilian in the Syrian area of the Golan Heights. It's worth remembering that one development of the Syrian civil war is the United States recognizing Israel's claim to the Golan Heights, which was territory, I believe, seized in the 67 war from Syria by Israel, and has long kind of been a shaded area on the map because it's Syrian territory. You're not allowed to wage war and take territory after World War II, or so international law goes. But at the same time, Israel was not going to get back the Golan Heights. And so now that the U.S. has recognized it, I'm not sure if the Syrians are going to give up on it, but that is kind of the war and conflict being waged from Damascus and then just down south of Syria, as Israel continues to take advantage of the situation, instability there, and continue their bombing. East of the Euphrates River in Syria, the United States is holding on to a pocket of territory, maybe or maybe not allied with Turkish forces in the area. This is some of the area of Syria where there's oil production, and the U.S. has essentially used our troops to be human shields and kind of barriers to run off anybody who tries to come in, mainly the Syrian government or the Russians, and get access to the oil. So far, this has remained almost non-lethal. I think the U.S. government at one point shot at some Syrian locals who may or may not have shot at the U.S. Soldiers first, but most of it seems to be that Americans run into Syrian checkpoints or Russian checkpoints. Russians run into American checkpoints. At one point, apparently, an American vehicle ran a Russian vehicle off the road. The real hotspot in tension right now is in northeastern central Syria, the Idlib province, where this is the last holdout of the al-Qaeda-linked Syrian rebels. At this point, I'm guessing it's mostly just the al-Nusra Front that is the opposition, but there may be either more moderate or ISIS-type forces mixed in there. There are some rebels that are supported by Turkey and then Turkish forces, and they're fighting against the Russians and the Syrian army as Syria looks to kind of liberate this area and put all of Syria under Assad's control. I mean, at this point, it doesn't seem like the rebels, and especially without any serious Turkish military invasion of Syria, really has the ability to fend off the Syrian government. And so as long as a massive incursion of Turks, across the border doesn't happen, it seems like eventually Assad will be able to retake the territory. The problem is that Erdogan seems willing to fight to hold on to. Now, part of this is a practical issue. Throughout the Syrian civil war, fighters from different areas of Syria and their families have all been relocated either forcefully or, in some kind of de-escalation deals with the Syrian government. So now there's a couple thousand people living in Idlib who will likely flee into, or a couple million people living in Idlib who will likely flee into Turkey if the Syrian government comes in and regains control over this territory. I also think that Erdogan, the president and leader of Turkey, is really looking to expand his territory and influence in the country, and hasn't done as well as far as expanding territory as in the fight against ISIS. Been able to, maybe occupy a little bit of northeastern Syria, and then the Afrin area of Syria, which is north of, the Aleppo province, like north central Syria. But overall, it doesn't seem like they're getting really much of what they wanted from all of this. And so maybe that's causing Erdogan to act recklessly. He's demanded several times that, Russia end the Syrian invasion or, liberation of Idlib. But, the Russians are pretty clear that's not going to happen. I think they want Assad to win the Syrian civil war so they could get out of Syria. And now it's created a conflict between, a very reckless and ambitious NATO ally and Assad and Putin, who are looking to, reestablish Assad's control over the rest of Syria. At this point, I guess I don't foresee this turning into a bigger conflict between NATO and Russia. However, people are talking that way. There's congressmen and senators talking about establishing a no-fly zone over Syria, which would mean shooting down Russian and Syrian planes flying over the Idlib territory. Very, very dangerous. Erdogan and Turkey are looking to, I don't know if they've actually formally looked to invoke Article 5 yet, but certainly, pointed out that this is apparently what the NATO alliance is for. Them invading other countries and then looking for the general defense of the alliance. Maybe once Erdogan realizes that he isn't going to get that, I can't imagine, Germany, France, UK, or even the US really fighting a war against Russia and Assad for northern Syria. It just doesn't seem like in any way could possibly be worth it for the US. So hopefully eventually cooler heads prevail here. Erdogan and Putin do have a relationship. At one point during the Syrian civil war, a Russian jet may or may not have floated over the Turkish border. It doesn't seem like it actually had any intentions of bombing anything in Turkey, but was targeting different kind of jihadist forces near the Turkish border, and was targeted and shot down by a Russian jet, a Turkish missile that happened to the Russian jet. I believe both pilots ended up dying. At least one was captured and killed. I'm not sure about the other one. And so there have been serious tensions between Russia and Turkey in this war before, and they've been worked out. And so I think, it's safe to say that the path is there for this to end peacefully, but it is one of the reasons that the U.S. needs to reconsider their commitment. All right, in India, and this kind of coincided with the arrival of Donald Trump, protests broke out against this law that seems pretty anti-Muslim to me. It's going to essentially allow non-Muslim people from countries that border India to get Indian citizenship. However, Muslim people don't have this ability. Then also you have, the steps that the Indian government under Modi has taken in the Kashmir region to, suppress and oppress the Muslims there. So, the people in India, there's 180 million Muslims in that country, are very unhappy with, the Hindu nationalism of the Modi government. And so they took to the streets in protest. Now, this has been going on for a while, but recently the clashes broke out apparently between Hindus and Muslims, resulting in at least 32 deaths at this point. All right, last thing I want to talk about today is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and this is going to be a dam of the Blue Nile River, which I believe is the main river along with the White Nile that feeds the Nile. Accounts for a lot of the water that goes from Sudan, Egypt, and so this dam is going to be absolutely massive. And once the dam is completed, it's going to have to fill its reservoir. And, I'm not a hydroelectric engineer, but from my understanding, to really start generating electricity, the reservoir has to be full. And so the Ethiopians want to do this as quick as possible, which would still take several years. I think like 3 or 4 years to fill if it really only lets through a trickle of the Blue Nile. Whereas the Egyptians maybe don't want them to construct this dam at all, but assuming it does, they want the fill to take over a decade. I guess the U.S. has been hosting talks and it has been making steps towards being resolved, but now the Ethiopians are asking the U.S. to delay the final negotiations. And so this has raised some concerns for me because Africa is a fairly unstable region. Water is really important in Africa. And the damming of rivers, not only in just, this area of Africa, but also the Middle East, Turkey, it has serious impacts on what's going on downriver and the economy and lives and stuff like that. Right now they're building dams in Turkey and flooding entire Turkish villages so that, people are forced to leave. So, these things are really complicated, and a solution needs to be worked out and hopefully peacefully. So, the talks not continuing at this point are somewhat concerning and something that I will keep an eye on. So make sure you're checking out the show and the news roundup over at the Libertarian Institute to get updates on that and, all the foreign policy and libertarian events that I try to cover. Make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. If you like it, give it a rating and review. Check out my account on Twitter at KYAAALE, and then donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.